So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Sophie Hackett. Did you know you were next, Sophie? Well, you do now. I just found out myself. Sophie is the curator of photography at the Art Gallery of Ontario and is an adjunct faculty member at Ryerson University's master's program in film photography, preservation, and collections management. She has contributed to several Canadian art magazines, international journals, and artist monographs, including Queer Looking, Joan E. Byron's slideshows in Aperture, and Encounters in the Museum, the experience of photographic objects in the edited volume, The Public Life of Photographs, which was co-published by Ryerson Image Center and MIT Press just this fall. Sophie has curated or co-curated a number of exhibitions and public projects during her tenure at the AGO, including Barbara Kruger, Untitled, It, Songs of the Future, Canadian Industrial Photographs, 1858 to Today, Max Dean, Album, A Public Project, Light My Fire, Some Propositions About Portraits and Photography, What It Means to Be Seen, Photography and Queer Visibility, and Fan the Flames, Queer Positions in Photography, as well as introducing Susie Lake. Sophie was the lead juror for the 2014 AIMIA/AGO Photography Prize, a role she also held in 2010 and 2012. Her most recent curated exhibition is Thomas Roof, Object Relations, and she co-curated Outsiders, American Photography and Film, 1950s to 1980s, both of which opened at the AGO this past spring. I'm delighted to introduce Sophie, especially because when she decided to go and be a curator at the AGO, I begged her not to. I asked her to stay in our department, and it's really a great pleasure to know how wrong one has been. Sophie.
So thank you very much, Elizabeth. That's a kind introduction, and you never know, I may be back. And thank you very much to the Center for Sexual Diversity Studies, Brenda and Asato and Sasha at the ROM for inviting me to participate. Great to see a good crowd out tonight on a beautiful fall evening. I'm going to talk very briefly about two shows that I put together in 2014. I won't really go in deeply into the sort of themes and the structure and what was who and what was in those exhibitions, except to sort of take a few examples from those shows of works, both of my kind of approach generally, but then some works that generated some discussions with my colleagues at both institutions about displaying the certain works and how we needed to talk about them or think about them. Some of which I could see coming and some of which I did not. None of it was, I will say, fatal for the project in any way, but we nonetheless had to have the discussions about what work, whose work, and for whom was it, could it be shown, and who needed to be protected in some ways. And a lot of disagreement even within each institution about how to approach that. So these two shows that you see, just installation views from, were one at the Ryerson Image Center and one at the AGO, both of which opened, two group shows, both of which opened on the same day in 2014. Not something I will do again very soon, but one has to throw oneself into these things occasionally. The shows, I envisaged them as somewhat complementary. So at the Ryerson Image Center, the show was called What It Means to Be Seen, Photography and Queer Visibility, and I wanted to think about the collective experience and sort of queer politics in photography, while Fan the Flames, Queer Positions in Photography at the AGO was really much more about a sort of individual expression or an individual stance, individual identity through the photographic medium. Both shows took had a long covered a number of decades, and some, very much called into question the idea of what do we call, what is queer, what is photography, what can we call queer photography, in fact? And in many cases, the answer is very open-ended, and you cannot ever say for sure that a certain picture is or is not of a queer subject or by a queer artist. I was certainly conscious in considering, in both shows, that I wanted to look at a full range of photographic images that related to the LGBTQ experience, chiefly in North America, though there are some objects that come from Europe or were created by French and German makers. But I was certainly conscious of wanting to expand a visual record, expand what might come into your mind when you think of the words queer and photography together, for better and for worse. And kind of defy those expectations to a certain degree. So in Toronto, at the AGO, Fan the Flames, this is the first gallery you walked into. What I'm highlighting here are two cases that included a range of physique magazines that came from a private collection. They really highlight, so as I thought about putting these shows together, I actually, in the end, although it didn't feel like a conscious decision at the time, though I think as I thought about putting things together and building out a visual record, in fact, in the end, there were no particularly sexually explicit images included in either show. But that's not to say that there weren't sexually suggestive works, and I like to think there were certain kind of moments that would allow for a visual pleasure, as it were, depending on who you are and what you're looking for. Certainly, I didn't shy away from nudity in any form. I think it's in art, in art museums we've seen nudity for years. You see the Massacre of the Innocents, John Paul Rubens's, gargantuan painting, and one part of our European galleries. And well, the bodies are fleshy and in evidence, but people have a different relationship to photography, and it still somehow is more real to them, more too real, in fact, sometimes. And that's something I need to contend with, and did contend with, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. So, the number of people as I walked through the galleries who sort of stood in front of these men of a certain age, really, who, or even not of a certain age, but men who kind of remembered finding physique magazines in magazine stores at a certain moment as they were discovering their own sexuality, sort of paused in some cases quite wistfully by these cases, and remember having to kind of rifle through behind all of other ladies' home journal and fashion magazines and comic books to get to the sort of, the object of their desire. So I wanted to highlight these as, of course, using very much photographic images, although not works of photography per se, as this visual culture element to kind of introduce in one form. So again, these were objects that were created with a particular purpose to kind of highlight beautiful bodies or a healthful lifestyle or art studies, and yet were kind of, let's say, repurposed or purposed, used in some way by individuals for their as a way of discovering their own sexuality. So I think there are a lot of those kinds of moments I liked that allowed for that. So here, another example of a physique magazine, as well as a photograph by Germaine Krull from 1930, just titled Les Amis. And that sort of ambiguity, the friends, is sort of very much part of that same suggestiveness. And even in more recent work, here we have Zachary Drucker and Reese Ernst from their series Relationship, which was is an extended document from 2008 to 2013 of their relationship as they each actually underwent transition, in kind of opposite directions. So you see some images of them kind of together in bed, but also just self-portraits. So this kind of idea of a sexual identity as multiple and ever-changing, and like the moments in our lives. I can point out certainly there are pictures like this one here in the mix, kind of from the corner of Reese. At a certain moment as he's transitioning, thinking about between his legs are a pair of eggs, and so that kind of, is it a yearning for different genitalia? Is it a kind of hope for? Is it playfulness? Is it just goofing around? So we kind of see the body in all different forms. I also highlighted another strategy, so I had sort of suggestiveness, we'll call it, as a strategy in selecting the works, but also I wanted to highlight a range of works that appropriated images from different moments. This is Shauna Dempsey and Laurie Milan, their magazine In the Life, which has been a favorite work of mine for many, many years, an almost perfect mimicry of Life magazine, a day in the life of a bull dyke. Or actually, it's a day in the life, portrait of a modern sex deviant is what's on the cover, and they pretty much restage in black and white the sort of the figure on the cover there, a day in a kind of butch lesbian's life, whom she works in a butcher shop. She, beds women, liberally. She sort of harasses this kind of all the stereotypes, trying to explode all the stereotypes about lesbianism at that particular moment through that appropriation. And also here, again, works from the collection of Vince Aletti, who has kind of created, something almost of a mood board or a kind of analog cloud, let's say, of looking. Vince, though, as many of you may know him as a writer, a critic. He worked for a long time for the Village Voice, but has also been a voracious collector of fashion magazines and kind of all things photographic, though never had a big budget to create an official big collection, but he nonetheless tore images out of newspapers and magazines, as many of us may have done the same, growing up, and kind of created his own, it's almost an extended portrait of his own looking, a kind of queering gaze. So this was kind of 20 or so feet. There's no one standing in front of it, but it's about 20 feet long on the wall. This is work Polaroids by Tom Bianchi, created on Fire Island from the mid-'70s to the early 1980s. And these were shown at the Ryerson Image Center as part of What It Means to Be Seen, Photography and Queer Visibility. And in that show, some of the works dealt with a kind of collective and very public experience, so activist actions, gay liberation parades. I looked at, again, also at Life magazine and the very first article in 1964, Homosexuality in America, and the photographs used in that article. But then I also used a number of bodies of work, included a number of bodies of work by artists known and unknown that depicted communities that were really images created for the most part for private uses, really, commemoration, friends, family, and so on, and included a number of those. They were not created for a museum setting. The section was called Private Worlds, as opposed to Public Faces. And this is where things start to get a little bit stickier from no pun intended, from a kind of ethics and exhibition standpoint. So, here we had Tom's full permission, and in many cases, actually, he talks a lot about making these pictures in the 70s and how the Polaroid really made these, of course, the Polaroid made these pictures possible. They're Polaroid, but it actually made the act of taking the picture possible because he could actually show his subjects, see, I'm not exposing you, and P.S., they're just for me, or if you don't want, I don't have to show your head. So there are actually a number of pictures of just bodies, which are, of course, there was clearly a looking and a pleasure in the bodies and the beach, and sort of bacchanalian weekends in this community, which is just off New York City, and it really is before the AIDS crisis hit. So they have, as Edmund White writing in the foreword to the book of these Polaroids, he talks about this kind of dream time, almost a dream moment where the skies are blue and the bodies are buff and tan and sex is plentiful. And so though there are no images of sex happening, there are certainly it's kind of implied in the pictures. So we have tanning and crotches, but so some of that was about the way he was negotiating consent with his subjects too. So they often had control over how they wanted to be depicted. And there are a few self-portraits too, which is pretty great. So these didn't provide, it's still something to think about, but they didn't necessarily provide much, any trouble in particular. So the vinyl blow up and then the snapshots in the case beside were taken at Casa Susana, which was actually two resorts in upstate New York from the late 1950s to the early 1960s, late 1960s actually, again pre-Stonewall. that were of a community of cross-dressers, and Susanna and her partner Marie would kind of put on these weekends, and you could come and dress en femme if you so chose. And these really, people are always very interested when you're showing snapshots or material really very much created for a specific community. You know, what are the ethics of this, and do people know that you're showing these pictures? And the answer to that is no, they don't know. However, you know, then this is where, you know, the case of this collective document, there are 340 snapshots from this particular community at this particular moment, is the collective good outweighed by the sort of well, some violation of private ethics in this particular case. And of course, if anyone came to me and said, that's my grandfather or my brother, or that's me, and I don't need to show that picture, we would remove it entirely. But we kind of definitely had those discussions, and the press is always very interested in this too. It's like, how can you show private photographs in a public museum? And so we've kind of balanced that in that way. And I've since shown some of these photographs. They're now in the collection of the Art Gallery of Ontario, and I've shown them again in one of the projects that just ended. And I think it's incredibly important in the question of visibility for queer communities, I think, to see yourself, and that idea of a visibility or becoming more visible, you know, has been a huge part of the kind of rhetoric of the movement through these decades. This is a bit of this group of photographs were made by an unknown police officer who worked in the precinct near the Bois de Boulogne in Paris in the late 80s and early 90s. We don't know his name. They come from a collection of photography in Chalon-sur-Saône, the Musée Nicéphore-Niepce. And they look like mugshots. We don't know for sure that they are mugshots. They were created at a time of, and I'll give you a detail here, at a time of kind of panic around AIDS and prostitution. The area was known as a kind of a red light district, and particularly for individuals who, coming from Latin America and Portugal and some parts of Africa, who were working as sex workers. And there was sort of panic around the spread of AIDS and through prostitution. So this particular photographer and the collection at the Musée Niepce has, I think there are more than 200 actually in total, but they come in pairs. So you have this very kind of strange duo of something that looks like an official police photograph of an individual holding up a sign with their name and sometimes birth date and birthplace. But then you have the second image where clearly the photographer has moved in closer and is kind of making a portrait, you know, and throughout, so you can see in some, well, it's hard to see in these, but throughout, the individuals are reacting differently as the photographer, the police officer, gets closer. They interact, and in some cases they give him the finger. In some cases they leer at him. Well, and actually, I'm assuming he's a man, but actually I don't know that. So leering at the photographer or kind of vamping for the photographer, and each one is kind of taking a different tack to this proximity. Are they going to try? Some are trying to seduce him. Some are trying to really get him to go away. And these pictures, because they are more recent, actually from the early 90s, you know, provoked a number of different reactions and raised a number of tough questions about whether or not we should show them at all. And again, I think it allowed us to talk about how current some of these issues still are, and I think that there is, and I chose to read them, and you know, we can have a discussion about whether I'm right about that or not. I chose to read the one sort of more official picture. You know, it was clearly an individual being kind of subjected to state scrutiny of some kind. It might have been just to kind of keep track of and to take care of the individuals, but it's hard to know. So anyway, someone being subjected to state scrutiny, and then the accompanying image as one that is more where the subjects were able to take more agency. In some cases, it seemed that was not happening, but we chose a range of pictures where it was clear someone was kind of I think really asserting a subjectivity, asserting an individuality through the picture, and so the dialogue between those two things was something I wanted to highlight. The last example I wanted to talk about, and this is a work in the collection of the AGO, work by Nan Golden, gifted to us a number of years ago. You know, Nan Golden to me is sort of like and of course artists to have in a collection, and not someone who is particularly controversial or whose images are particularly controversial anymore. As we were planning the show, you know, colleagues in the marketing department sort of asked for an image for marketing purposes. This is the image I sent off because we were still figuring things out with the exhibition, and they kind of came back to and said, well, can you send me something else, you know? And I sort of thought, what do you mean? Like, this is in our collection. We really want to highlight this work. Like, it's graphic. It has a certain sexiness to it. It has a, you know, why wouldn't we want to use this? You know, and as I kind of dug and as we had the conversation, it was clear that the picture made, well, both the individual in question uncomfortable, but that they also, as thinking through the marketing, they thought it was not a suitable marketing image. And so we really went back and forth about this. And ultimately, the image got used in some marketing vehicles, but not in others. So those where if you're an AGO member and you're getting the membership magazine, fine, it's in there. But if you are getting an AGO supplement for someone who isn't a member, so i.e. it's a thing coming that you didn't ask for, we didn't use it in those contexts. But what was fascinating, too, was that the individual in question actually thought it was a naked woman as well, so thought that the sort of bare chest included sort of, you know, the individual is bare-breasted, but it's, you know, it was very interesting to kind of even engage that conversation, and this was 2 years ago, you know, so it was a kind of tough moment, and I was so sort of surprised and offended, but then thought, actually, this is, well, this is the world we are in, you know, these are my colleagues, and so we need it, and it's one of those things that actually I wished I'd had more time to have some of those conversations on a longer timeline in the lead up to the show. In any case, I think, well, I'll stop it there, and we can get into it further in the discussion. Thank you.